growing pains. Rumo had acquired 25 new teeth in the 8 weeks he'd spent as a prisoner on Roaming Rock. Many were broad, short, and blunt, others long with wheedle-sharp points, or flat and thin with cutting edges as keen as a knife. The pain inflicted by Rumo's sprouting teeth had become an unpredictable visitor that kept moving around his mouth. Sometimes it lodged at the back of his upper jaw, sometimes at the front of the lower jaw, sometimes in the left cheek, sometimes in the right, and sometimes in 3 or 4 places at once. Rumo's efforts to ignore it were aided by the rewards this agony brought in its return. Whenever a place stopped hurting, it meant that nature had presented him with a new work of art. Besides, he had learned how to use these new tools of his. There was a piece of driftwood lying in the corner of his niche, and he chewed on it as often as he could. After only a few days, it looked as if it had been attacked by termites. Rumo noticed other changes in his body. His funny little paws were developing into slender hands composed of 3 fingers and a thumb armed with sharp, graceful claws. The most fascinating thing was that he could now grasp objects with them. This gave him a wonderfully pleasurable sensation, as if he had been presented with the additional power over things. The muscles in his hind legs were swelling, his fur was becoming smoother. Everything about him seemed to be growing, taller, more supple, bigger, and stronger. His coat was losing its pinkish shade and turning white as snow. He didn't look as cute, but this was offset by his increasingly handsome appearance. His snub nose was developing into an thin, elegant muzzle, his baby fat into symmetrical rows of stomach muscles, and his forelegs were becoming athletic, muscular arms. His shoulders were growing broader, while his waist remained slim. His big saucer eyes were narrowing into mysterious predatory slits. Rumo was growing up, an abnormally rapid process in the case of a Wolperting. "I can actually see you growing," Smike told him. "You walk across the cave and you're a head taller when you reach the other side." Rumo gave a sheepish laugh. He had been able to squeeze into his niche for several days. Like all the rest, he now had to remain in the cave where the demonicals came visiting, and they couldn't fail to notice him in the end. Their mouths watered at the sight of such an interesting beast. Lions and red gorillas were considered great delicacies, and it delighted them to watch their muscles and sinews twitch as they skinned them alive. But this creature, this horned dog with dark eyes and silky white fur, was unlike any animal they had ever kept on Roaming Rock before. It promised to be even more delicious than all the big game they had ever torn into pieces. The demonicals treated Rumo as if he were maturing in their cave like an exceptionally precious bottle of vintage wine. Rumo thought his hour had struck when the one-eyed monsters came to gawp at him, which they continually did. Smike had urged him to walk on all 4s, and he did so whenever the demonicals were present, but that could not disguise his attractions. The cave was sometimes visited by demonicals who thrust him into the corner, grunting and smacking their lips, their way, it seemed, to discussing his physical development. They pinched his legs and stomach muscles, sniffed his fur, plucked out hairs, and examined them. The saliva gushed from their stinking mouths as they rejoiced at his lightning reflexes. He could tell that it was all they could do not to sink their fangs into him on the spot. Every time they departed without dragging him away, he felt he had been born anew. Rumo's physical development was matched by his linguistic progress. He was now capable of conversing fluently with Smike, although his use of words was still on par with that of a traveler who has been studying a foreign language for only a few weeks. He could understand nearly everything, the Wolpertings. "What's happening to me?" Rumo asked Smike one night. The waves were breaking against Roaming Rock with exceptional violence, filling its interior with a thunderous, awe-inspiring roar. "Why am I growing so fast?" "Because you're a Wolperting," Smike replied. Rumo put his head on one side, as he always did when an answer dissatisfied him. Smike sighed. "Oh well," he said, "I think it's about time you learned something about yourself and your breed. I don't know all that much, but—" "Go on," Rumo commanded. Smike drew a deep breath. "There's a saying about Wolpertings that probably conveys more about them than any other. It's, 'You might as well tangle with a Wolperting.'" Smike grinned. The Zemonians often use that phrase when they want to dissuade someone from doing something incredibly stupid, something that could be lethal, or is doomed to failure. Wolpertings have inherited the characteristics of wolves and deer. That makes them strong, wild, skittish, nimble, and dangerous. They have instincts and reflexes possessed by no other living creature in Zemonia, and their sensory organs have developed in a unique way. They can see with their noses and ears if need be. They're so fast and agile that their movements sometimes convey a magical impression. Rumo pricked up his ears. Although Smike was using rather high-flown language, he gathered that he was trying to explain that Wolpertings were very special creatures. Why had he withheld this gratifying information for so long? Wolpertings fall into 2 categories: the wild ones, who never learn to speak and spend their lives on all 4s, and the civilized ones who sooner or later stand up on their hind legs and start to speak. When Wolperting whelps reach the age at which they develop their first fangs, it becomes apparent which they are, wild or civilized. You clearly belong to the second category. The words that slumbered inside Rumo, the peculiar mixture of thoughts and sensations that had arisen within him, he was beginning to understand them now. Intellectually, wild Wolpertings are more or less on par with wolves and live mainly in the forests and steppes of Zamonia. Many of them can even be tamed and spend their lives on farms, where they act as well-tended watchdogs. Smike gave Rumo a long look before he went on. Yes, he had decided to tell him the truth even if he couldn't grasp it yet. You're an orphan, Rumo. It's one of the ruthless traditions of your breed that Wolperting parents, both wild and civilized, abandon their newborn whelps in the wilderness soon after their birth. If they develop into wild Wolpertings, they've already found their natural habitat. If they're capable of speech, they have to find their way to civilization unaided. Rumo was feeling overtaxed. Words like orphan, ruthless, habitat, and civilization meant nothing to him. So where am I going? He asked. Smike laughed. You're going nowhere. You're on Roaming Rock. Rumo cocked his head again. Listen, said Smike, lowering his voice. If I told you of a plan to escape this cave and release the others, what would you think of it? It would be good, said Rumo. What if I said you're the most important part of this plan? I'd be proud, said Rumo. And what if I said you'd have to risk your life in order to carry it out? I'd be even prouder. Good. I'll give the plan some more thought, and I'll tell you about it when the time is ripe, said Smike, holding out one of his little hands. Rumo shook it. It was moist and sticky, but he felt very honored all the same. Smike taught Rumo something new about fighting every day. Tricks and technique were seldom mentioned. Smike enjoyed lecturing on the theoretical aspects of combat, and there were times when Rumo didn't understand a word. One day, for instance, Smike told him, It's trite but true, but to say that thinking too much while you're fighting is a positive disadvantage. Don't get me wrong, a good fighter mustn't be a brainless idiot. He must simply have the strength to decide to act rather than think at that crucial moment. No, what am I saying? Strength doesn't come into it. The opposite is true. The decision mustn't be an effort. It must be like relieving yourself. Rumo gave a puzzled growl and knitted his brow. When you pass water, you're releasing something pent up inside you, right? It's like being set free. It's easy, satisfying, and positively enjoyable. You simply let go. If you wanted to, you could pass water all day long, whatever you happen to be, but you don't. Instead of making a mess, you hold it in until it hurts. Then you let it flow, and it's a relief, am I right? Well, that's just the way you should fight, as if you were peeing. Rumo was bewildered. Smike had been rhapsodying about heroic battles and victories the whole time, and now he was talking about passing water. Wolpertings urinated often, like any Simonian life form whose veins contained the blood of primeval dogs, but he couldn't fathom what his fat friend was getting at. Think about it, said Smike. Rumo recalled Smike's remarks later on when he was relieving himself at a dark corner of the cave, but still didn't understand. What had peeing to do with fighting? Rumo dreams of vengeance. By now nearly all of the Hakonians who had raised Rumo were gone. The demonicals had dragged them out of the cave one by one, and none had ever returned. Rumo lamented their disappearance because by the time he knew what had happened to them, in addition to teeth and muscles, he was developing an unpleasant feeling. As regards to the demonicals, it was a hopeless, helpless, desperate emotion. A wish to make the demonicals pay for what they had done to his dead friends. In other words, he thirsted for revenge. He knew at the same time that he was powerless against the demonicals, being so small and weak by comparison. He was growing, yes, and growing fast, but even if he developed into the strongest and most dangerous Wolperting of all time, what could one solitary creature do against hundreds of demonicals? He couldn't expect any assistance from the surviving Hakonian dwarfs, nor from Smike, that ungainly tub of lard. Even if the strongest creatures in the cave, the wild beasts, joined forces with them, they couldn't stand a chance against the one-eyed giants. What on earth could Smike's plan be? Giant repellent. The prisoners in the cave had resigned themselves to their fate as time went by. They had grasped that it was pointless to spend the whole day weeping and wailing. Not even fear lasts forever. Sooner or later, everlasting danger transforms it into apathy. Although the Hakonians' hearts still missed a beat whenever a demonical entered the cave, they had devised ways of making themselves look as inconspicuous, unattractive, and unappetizing as possible. Many of them had smeared themselves with slime from Smike's pool, which Rumo, being free to move around, gladly distributed among them. Word had spread that movement whetted demonicals' appetite, so they kept as still as possible, or pretended to be asleep whenever one of them inspected the cave. This had no real effect on the one-eyed monster's voracious habits, because they had ways and means of making their prey twitch if they thought it necessary. The only place they steered well clear of was Smike's pool, the source of the evil-smelling slime. Rumo was proud of being the only one in the cave with a potent antidote to fear. He could go to see Volzaton Smike and be transported into another world. Words were so incredibly powerful, although many still meant nothing to him and were simply meaningless sounds. Others had barely escaped Smike's lips when they became transformed into marvelous images that filled Rumo's head and drove his fear away. Sometimes when Smike was telling an especially interesting story, image succeeded image, until the flood of impressions transported Rumo far away into other, better times. Smike had an answer to every question, sometimes satisfying, sometimes productive of even greater bewilderment, but even bewilderment was preferable to frozen despair. Netherworld. One evening, when some demonicals had behaved even more barbarously than usual and torn a piglet to pieces before Rumo's eyes, his feeling of impotence threatened to turn into uncontrollable panic. Dark questions took shape in his head. Unable to answer them himself, he went to see Smike. "What's new, Rumo?" asked Smike. He propped his head on the edge of the pool with a lazy seal, while the rest of his body remained hidden in the slime. Rumo sighed. "I was wondering if there's any place more frightful than this one." Smike had to think harder than usual before something occurred to him. "They say there is," he replied. "What's worse than here? What's it called?" "Netherworld," said Smike. "Netherworld," Rumo repeated. It sounded sinister. "I don't know if it's an actual place or just a word. Perhaps it's just a tall tale. I've often heard soldiers speak of it around the campfires. They say there's another world beneath this one that's filled with evil, vicious creatures. Everyone has his own idea of the place, but I've never met anyone who has actually been there. Maybe it's because no one who goes to evil places ever comes back. You're in a grave mood today, my boy. How about a riddle?" "All right," said Rumo. "Ask me one." Smike had taken to setting Rumo simple problems. It sharpened the youngster's wits and dispelled his gloomy thoughts. "What can penetrate a wall but isn't a nail?" asked Smike. "No idea," said Rumo. "I know, but I want you to work it out." And he sank back into his pool because he couldn't have endured any more questions that evening. One afternoon, the girl slid back with a crash and 4 demonicals charged in bellowing. Rumo had an uneasy feeling as the giants strode across the cave. They came straight for him, grabbed him by the arms, and threw him into an empty cage from which they'd taken the lion. They locked the door of the cage and strode out. Rumo's free-ranging days were over. He shook the bars and growled at the departing giants. The cage was cramped, which meant that he would have to relieve himself where he slept. He, too, was now at the demonical's mercy. He shook the bars again, but they were immovable, and not even his teeth could bite through the metal. How would Smike explain his plan now? He couldn't even visit the pool anymore, and the shark grub had never left his slimy basin. Rumo had no idea if he was capable of doing so. Smike had dived to the bottom of his pool, where not even his dorsal fin shoved above the surface. The big fat bubbles that rose from the depths burst with a revolting sound, pervading the cave with a noisome stench of sulfur. Smike was pondering. One aspect of his escape plan had still to be worked out. For this he needed certain information. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew that he could still refresh his powers of recall in the Chamber of Memories. Having excited some extra big bubbles of slime, he set off through the convolutions of his brain in the slow, leisurely way that came naturally to him. Then he entered the Chamber of Memories, ignoring the draped picture as usual. He resolutely made for one he hadn't looked at for a long time. It was a picture of a table, one of the red felt gaming tables to be found in all Fort Una's gambling dens. The felt was littered with colored wooden gaming chips, and as he looked at them he also heard the hum of voices, the whir of roulette reels, and the rattle of dice, all the sounds that had once filled his days and nights. And then he was sitting at the table, his gaming table, which he ran his capacity as an officially certified croupier and dealer. He wanted to remember one particular night, the night the mad professor had come to his table, the professor with 7 brains. "Excuse me," said the peculiar little gnome, "but would you permit me to have a bit of flutter?" Being a croupier, accustomed to people with far coarser manners, Smike was amused by his courteous tone. "Of course," he replied. "How about a hand of Rumo?" "Whatever you suggest," said the gnome, as he took his place at the table. He was obviously a nocturnomath, a Zomodian life form with several brains. Smike had never seen one before, but the grotesque excrescences on the goggle-eyed, humpbacked creature's head matched the other people's description of the breed. "May I introduce myself? Nightingale's the name. Professor Abdullah Nightingale." Smike inclined his head. "Smike, Volzaton Smike. For a start, then, a hand of Rumo." He dealt the cards. The professor won every game they played. Rumo, Midgardian Rummy, Florenthian Poker, Catch the Troll, and finally Rumo again. Before the 3 hours were up, small fortune in colored chips was piled high in front of him. He was clearly using a system based on the number 7. That much Smike had gathered. Nightingale placed his bets in stacks of 7 chips on numbers divisible by 7, and he also played his cards according to a system somehow based on 7. He not only drew attention to this each time, but explained his intricate calculations, which entailed the addition, multiplication, and division figures up to 7 digits long, until Smike's brain was in turmoil. The Nocturnomath won again and again. He wasn't there to make money, he declared, but to test a mathematical system. The sweat that was streaming down Smike's face had nothing to do with the torrid atmosphere of the gambling den. It was the cold sweat of mortal fear. The table was surrounded by curious spectators, among them the owners of the saloon, 2 Volphads named Henko and Hasso Van Drill. One-eyed twins and former highwaymen, Henko and Hasso had amassed their starting capital by strangling well-heeled travelers in the neighborhood of Devil's Gulch. It was their hard-earned money that was passing into the professor's possession. Although Fort Una's gambling dens did not cheat their patrons outright, they were run on semi-criminal lines. This meant that the ultimate winners were the owners of the gambling dens, not their customers. To ensure the system ran smoothly, the owners employed people like Smike, professional card sharks, who could beat the average player without cheating. They sometimes let the gamblers win, and even paid out substantial sums, but the house always made a decent profit by the end of the night, and now this professor was overturning the whole concept of Fort Una. He was winning every game without exception. This wasn't just run of the luck, he was a breach of Fort Una's unwritten law. Everyone loses in the end. Smike was powerless to prevent Nightingale from multiplying his winnings every time. If he went on this way, the house would be bankrupt after a few more games. The Volphads gave Smike a look that conveyed some idea of the treatment he could expect in the alley behind the saloon if he failed to end the professor's lucky streak in a very short time. "How about another hand?" the professor asked brightly, as he arranged his chips in stacks of 7. "I'm developing quite a taste for gambling." "As you wish," Smike said in a choking voice. "With us, the customer is king. You ought to do something about that excessive perspiration of yours," the professor said, glancing at the film of sweat on Smike's brow. "Salt tablets work wonders sometimes." Smike dealt the cards with an agonized smile. The professor mumbled some figures, staked his entire winnings on a single hand, placed his cards in accordance with this absurd system of 7s, and won again. "My goodness!" he chuckled as he raked in his winnings. "What am I to do with all this money? I shall possibly invest it in darkness research, or possibly construct an oracular chest of drawers. The possibilities are limitless. Another hand?" He won 4 more games, which almost cleaned out the Volphads. Smike's heart was pounding, his head spinning. He yearned to wring the mad professor's scraggy, vulturine neck. But the Volpad brothers would save him the trouble. Another mysterious accident in a lawless town, a fatal fall down the back steps of a gambling den, sustained by an absent-minded, intoxicated professor whose clothes reeked of brandy. No one would give a doctor bribed by the Volphads would make out the death certificate. Accidental death, self-induced, evidence of alcohol abuse, and there would be one more nameless grave in the desert behind Fort Una. In despair, Smike longed to inform the Nocturnomath that he was gambling with his own life as well as the dealers. The spectators and the Volpad brothers pressed closer, listening expectantly to the polite conversation in progress between the dealer and the gambler. "I know," said a voice in Smike's head. "That's great," he thought. "I'm so scared I've lost my wits. I'm starting to hear voices." "You're only hearing one voice, and it's mine. It's me, Nightingale," said the voice. "Don't give yourself away." Smike tensed, staring across the table. The professor appeared to be engrossed in his hand. "Listen, I possess the gift of telepathy. No big deal for a Nocturnomath. We all have it. And now to your problem. I may seem a trifle unsophisticated, but I'm not tired of life. I've no intention of letting 2 notorious villains stab me to death in a dark alley, or something similar, for the sake of filthy lucre. However, I'd like to finish testing my system, savor my triumph to the full, and leave these crooks to sweat a little longer. Shall we play another hand of Rumo?" Either it really was the professor's voice he was hearing, or he'd gone mad after all. Smike wasn't sure. The Nocturnomath hadn't favored him with a single glance throughout his speech. In fact, he'd been joking with the gamblers and crooks standing around him. Mechanically, Smike dealt the cards. "Wait, another hand?" the professor said loudly. "I was going to call it a night, actually, but never mind. One more, then? All or nothing, as before?" The Volpad brothers scowled and felt in their pockets to satisfy themselves that their Florenthian glass daggers were there. "All or nothing," the professor cried gaily. Everyone held their breath. 7777777.77 divided by 7, 7777777. .777 divided by 77 comes to the professor muttered to himself, moving his cards around with his maddening deliberation. Smike's rivulets of perspiration had combined to form an oily film that covered his entire body. He glistened like a waxed apple. "Professor," he called desperately in his head. "Professor, surely you don't intend to win again. That would be suicide and murder, if you include me." But there was no reply. "Let's see," muttered the nocturnal mouth. "The square root of 777, 777, 777, 777.7 divided by the product of 77, 777, 777.777 times 777 to the power of 7 makes The rest was unintelligible. The professor laid his cards down by one. He had won yet again. "Professor!" If Smike's thoughts had been audible, they would have been an anguished cry. Nightingale looked at him expressionlessly. "Where can I cash in my chips?" he asked. "I hope you'll provide me with some sacks to carry my winnings in." "Of course," one of the Voltpads said coolly. "We'll settle up with you in our office. That's the best plan. Over a couple of drinks on the house." Smike's head was spinning. He could already see himself lying sprawled in the alley, choking on his own blood. "Another hand?" he cried desperately. If anything had sealed his fate, it was those words. The Voltpads might otherwise have let him off with a few broken arms and a tongue lashing, but now that he had focused everyone's attention on the professor once more, just when the brothers had almost persuaded him to accompany them to their office, that was tantamount to a self-imposed death sentence. "Another hand of Rumo?" said the professor. "Double or quits?" Smike nodded. Nightingale grinned. "Why not?" Smike shuffled the cards again and dealt. Nightingale began to mumble figures to himself, and it was all the Voltpads could do not to murder the professor in their croupier in front of everyone. 777.7 multiplied by 7 is Nightingale glanced at the Voltpads to see whether they were sweating too. They were. Smike made another half-hearted attempt at mental communication. "Professor?" he telepathized. "Professor Nightingale?" No response. Nightingale was tapping his cards, lost in thought. 777.7 multiplied by 7 to the power of 7 minus the square root of 777 makes "Professor," Smike yelled in his head, "are you there?" Nothing, not a sound, not a flicker of emotion on Nightingale's face, so he really had succumbed to his hallucination engendered by his own panic. 777.777 multiplied by 77 divided by the sum of 777 plus 777 times 777 divided by 6, burbled the professor. Smike gave a start. Divided by 6? It was the first time in Nightingale's calculations had included any number apart from 7. The nocturnal math laid his cards down with an amiable smile. The spectators bent over the table. A groan ran around the saloon. The professor had lost. "Yes," the Nightingale's voice said in Smike's head. "You called me?" Smike didn't reply. He was too busy raking in the professor's chips and exchanging looks of relief with the Voltpad brothers, who could now let go of their glass daggers. "That was an interesting experience," the professor told Smike in his normal voice as the crowd dispersed. "Easy come, easy go. It seems that the mathematical system capable of defeating chance has yet to be devised. At all events, mine will be consigned to the chamber of unperfected patents. Self-criticism is the mother of invention." Smike stared at him. "But you could have gone winning forever. You know that perfectly well." Nightingale rose and laid his hand on Smike's shoulder. "There's only one thing that goes on forever, and that's darkness." At that moment something happened, the reason why Smike had entered the chamber of memories and seen the picture on the gambling table. When the professor's hand touched his shoulder, a tidal wave of information surged through Mike's brain so swiftly and unexpectedly that it jolted his head and almost sent him toppling over backwards, complete with his chair. Through that brief physical contact, the absent-minded Nocturnimath had deliberately or inadvertently collated the ideas that were racing through his various brains and transmitted them to Smike by means of his telepathic ability to infect others with intellectual bacteria. For Nightingale, a quite commonplace process; for Smike, a memorable experience. Briefly summarize, those ideas related to seismographic oscillations in the Bluebird Mountains, astronomical vortex physics, black holes, nebular motion, solar system rotation, chemical communication between South Simonian insects, reptiles, and orchids, olfactory transmission of information, exchanges of fluid between greater snakes, pollen vibration by nectar-producing Venus flytraps, and the haptic ability of Zomodian honeybees to communicate with Zomodian flora, geotic anomalies in the Demerara Desert and their influence on Simonian travelogues, the connection between the Alpen-born music of Demon Range and the prevalence of avalanches in the same region, the repercussions of nocturnomathic physics on the pseudo-scientific writings of Hildegard Mythmaker. They also related to the Zebraskan glorification of obstinacy, to deposits of sea salt in algal dimensions, to the telepathic perception of multicerebral life forms was massively bombarded with scintillas and irradiated with will-o'-the-wisps, the desensification of darkness and the cerebral convolutions of persons artificially dispirited by being subjected to brass band music and low barometric pressure, and the real reason why Smike had activated this memory in the first place, to the abnormal structure of Demonical's tongues and its effect on their sense of balance. Smike had found the memory that would help him to perfect his escape plan. Rumo's special diet. Rumo grew at an even more breakneck pace in the next few weeks. He discovered some changes in his body almost daily, whether it was a powerful muscle, a fully developed claw, and a large bone, or a brand new tooth. The Demonical's interest in him had steadily intensified since he had been in the cage. He had previously been allotted the same fare as all the other scraps of fish and bone the Demonicals tossed into the cave, the indeterminate mush they tipped into troughs for the vegetarians among their captives, and the pools they continually replenished with rainwater. The Demonicals were not particularly intelligent, but they were not so stupid as to let their prisoners starve. In any case, the food they gave them, millet, raw vegetables, gnawed bones, and the like, was worthless to themselves from the culinary aspect because it could neither kick nor scream. Ever since his confinement in the cage, however, Rumo had enjoyed a diet that was the envy of the other inmates of the cave. The one-eyed monsters brought him buckets of cool rainwater, freshly caught fish, lobsters, crabs, crayfish, plucked seabirds, and seal meat. Although he felt rather embarrassed, Rumo wolfed the lot. He had recently developed an insatiable appetite that could have gone eating without a break. It was as if his body converted every meal into bigger muscles, additional teeth, or a centimeter's growth. He devoured slabs of whale blubber, half sharks, and once even an octopus tentacle almost as big as himself. The Demonicals who rejoiced at his appetite laughed and prodded him with sticks to test his reflexes. The bigger and stronger he grew, the more their eyes shone with undisguised voracity. A group of 8 Demonicals regularly visited the cave to check on Rumo's progress. They were the floating island's chieftains, the strongest and most ferocious of all their kind. Rumo had been watching them for some time. They evidently possessed privileges that ranked them above the rest of the one-eyed giants. They were entitled to pick out the finest tidbits and possessed cages of their own in which they kept and fatted wild beasts that no one else could touch. They had lately taken to visit Rumo several times a day and tossing live fish through the bars. He wolfed them without a qualm. In fact, he devoured them ravenously. The masters of the island registered this with an evil grin, delighted by the wild dog's willingness to eat live food like themselves. They proceeded to discuss something in their raucous language, something that highly excited them, to judge by the way their voices trembled with greed and saliva oozed from the corners of their mouths. Finally, they thumped one another on the chest until the cave rang. Among the Demonicals, not that Rumo knew it, this was a sign of pleasurable anticipation. The giants' pecking order. The Demonicals of the island spent most of the time vegetating. They either hammered away at the rocks with primitive stone tools, or lay around in the sun staring at the sea or the clouds, which they believed to be flying mountains, or which they would dwell in when they died. The remainder of the time they devoted to sleeping or eating. There was no kind of government on Roaming Rock. The Demonicals weren't advanced enough for that. Mentally they were on par with cavemen who had just discovered fire but didn't really know what to do with it. All the man-made objects on the island, the cages, chains, and clubs, were the proceeds of forays ashore. It was one of the island's greatest intellectual feats to have grasped how a looted padlock and key worked. The Demonicals believed that the sun was the eye of the one-eyed giant who held a bowl of water in which floated Roaming Rock and a few other islands. That was their conception of the universe. The island witnessed occasional stirrings of something akin to social life. For instance, when 2 Demonicals had chosen the same place in the sun or live prey for supper, they usually got down to business right away. It wasn't pleasant to watch 2 Demonicals fighting. Tactics didn't come into it. All that mattered were strength and brutality coupled with stamina and the ability to soak up an exceptional amount of punishment. The giants fought without even considering the possibility of ducking or taking evasive action. They simply smote each other in the face until one of them fell dead because a Demonical remained on his feet for as long as he possibly could. That was how the group of 8 chieftains had fought their way to the top of the course of time, by having tougher chins and being able to dish out more punishment than the average Demonical. They were the rulers of the island, but their administrative activities were confined to evicting other Demonicals from the best places in the sun or snatching the choicest tidbits from under their noses. They also led raiding parties ashore and claimed the best items of plunder for themselves. Their notions of rulership and authority were no more well-defined than that, Smike's forebodings. Meantime, Smike remained at the bottom of the pool and continued to excrete his vile-smelling slime. The giant's drumming, which had grown louder by the day, was audible even down there as a series of rhythmical vibrations. If Smike's prognosis was correct, the demonicals would soon be in a feeding frenzy. The cave stocks of food had dwindled in recent months, and they were becoming less juicy. Smike's chances of survival improved with every drop of stinking slime he produced, but his current problem was a different nature. He had to overcome a fear that had steadily grown in the course of his sojourn on Roaming Rock and was now almost paralyzing him, the fear of emerging from his pool. In order to tell Rumo his plan, he would have to leave the protective slime and make his way over to the cage. The very thought of it made him feel sick. It was a fear that weighed Smike down like a 10-ton anchor. That night Rumo had a dream. His dreams had become more vivid and terrifying since he had been in the cage, and most of them concerned the demonicals. They often showed their one-eyed giants entering the cave en masse for a final bloodbath, and Rumo had to watch them powerless because he was either chained up, imprisoned in the cage, or simply unable to move. Until they eventually fell on him too. But this dream was different. He was free, he was on dry land, and he was trotting across a field of tall grass beneath a cloudless sky. High in the air above him hovered the silver thread whose presence he had first sensed back on the farm, and he was gripped by an indefinable emotion, a feeling of unbridled anticipation. He couldn't tell what it portended, but he sensed that it was the first real thing in his life would ever have to offer him. Not that he knew it, Rumo was dreaming of love. Feeding time. Next morning, Rumo was roused by someone kicking the bars of his cage, not an unusual form of awakening. A doltish-looking demonical was standing outside with a dead seal in one great paw and a cudgel in the other. He thrust the seal through the bars and tested Rumo's reflexes by prodding him with the cudgel. He wasn't one of the chieftains, so he performed his chore sullenly and unenthusiastically, well aware that he wouldn't get a share of such a prize delicacy. Rumo growled. The demonical turned away and resolved to console himself by devouring a plump marsh hog, so he plodded off towards the pigsty. A second demonical entered the cave yawning and strode resolutely toward the pigsty. Clearly he also felt peckish for some squealing piglets. The yawning gave a lurch just as they got there, throwing them off balance, and they collided. They snarled angrily at each other. The first demonical raised his cudgel, but a fist crashed into his face before he could recover. The blow's second punch caught him full in the jaw. He tottered backwards, stumbled, and fell flat on his back. His opponent, who was on him in a flash, punched him unmercifully again and again until he lay still. Then, grunting with exertion, he dragged him out of the cave. Smike had been covertly watching this brief but barbarous contest from his pool. He wondered whether the demonicals were cannibals who ate the dead. They were certainly voracious enough to render this a possibility. Most of the one-eyed giants had a very low tolerance threshold, were capable of flying into a rage at the drop of a hat. This was the moment that Smike had yearned for most ardently and feared most intensely. An opening had presented itself, and unless he seized it, the chance would be gone forever. The time to act had come. Smike leaves the pool. Rumo stared in surprise at Smike's pool. Strange sounds, revolting gurgles, and squelching noises were issuing from it, and the water was sloshing and splashing in all directions. Panting, cursing, groaning, Smike emerged from the ooze, hauled himself over the edge of the pool, and crawled across the cave. He had made straight for Rumo's cage, leaving an oily trail of olive-green slime behind him. This remarkable spectacle was watched in silence by all the other inmates of the giant's larder. Rumo stood up and poked his nose through the bars. Mike was panting hard by the time he reached the cage. Listen carefully. I don't have much time. If the demonicals catch me out here... Smike looked at Rumo and drew a deep breath. I'm scared, Rumo nodded, but I've got a plan I'd like to tell you about. All right. Smike outlined his plan. It was outrageous. It was totally insane. It sounded like a grisly fairy tale, a bloodthirsty dream of revenge, and it had absolutely no prospect of success. Well, he said, what do you think? I'll try it, Rumo replied. Great. Now listen, I've taught you all I know about fighting, but practical experience of fighting is another matter. That you'll have to gain by yourself. I'm sure it'll come quite naturally. Simply let it flow like... I know, Rumo cut in. You'd better get back into the pool now. It's too dangerous. One more thing. It's the most important point of all. The whole key to my plan. Smike clung to the bars and Rumo pricked up his ears. There's something you should know about demonicals' tongues, my boy. Bloodlust. Rumo had now been imprisoned in the cage for so long that he'd abandoned his attempts to escape unaided. He no longer rattled the bars or chewed the padlock. Why not eating or sleeping? He simply sat there in idleness, The most he ever did was pace restlessly to and fro in a confined space. His mouth had stopped hurting days ago, and his ravenous hunger had also subsided. He contented himself with smaller helpings, and became more choosy in regard to the food that mononcles tossed him through the bars. In recent days the motion of roaming rock had steadily increased in violence, as had the thunder of the waves that broke against it. The floating island seemed to be laboring through the heavy seas. Chaos reigned in the cave. The surviving Haconians hung limp in their chains, their helpless bodies striking the walls like bell clappers. The piglets started biting each other, and the few remaining wild animals roared and rampaged in their cages. The stinking water in Smike's pool slopped over the edge and flooded the cave. The demonicals appeared to have reached the climax of their festivities. The sound of their instruments, their shouts and singing, filled the tunnels and caverns of roaming rock. Worst of all, they visited the cave 3 times more often than usual. Rumo was clinging to the bars of his cage, and for the umpteenth time going over the various phases of Smike's plan. There were only 2 when the 3 demonicals came blundering into the cave. They were dead drunk, to judge by the blood with which they were smeared from head to foot. For a while they staggered aimlessly to and fro, sniffing the contents of their larder. One of them slipped on Smike's slime and measured his length on the floor of the cave, much to his companion's amusement. Stung by their raucous laughter, the angry giant crawled over to the pool and thrust his arm into it, doubtless intending to punish Smike by devouring him. Rumo clung to the bars of his cage, transfixed. The demonical fished for his prey in the ooze, cursing, but Smike was not to be caught so easily and kept slipping through his fingers. Suddenly there was a terrible crash. A huge wave must have struck roaming rock, because the floor of the cave gave a violent lurch and inundated the giant with slime. The 2 burst into a terrible roar of laughter. Really infuriated now, the dripping demonical bent over the pool and punched downwards in the hope of connecting with Smike's submerged form. One of the other demonicals remembered why he had come and seized a Haconian. He simply wrenched the dwarf away from the wall without removing the chains, tearing off one of his spindly arms. The Haconian screamed like a stuck pig, kicking and struggling with his little legs and one remaining arm. This attracted the attention of the 3rd demonical, who strode up and grabbed one of the unfortunate victim's legs. Thoroughly incensed by this, the other giant gave a menacing roar and tugged at his supper. His competitor hung on to the leg and hauled it in a frenzy, ripping the Haconian in half. This enraged the demonicals even more because of their lifeless quarry. Being past screaming and struggling was worthless to them. The dwarf had made a terrible escape from an even more terrible fate. The disappointed giants hurled hoarse reproaches at each other while their companion continued to fish for Smike. Rumo's blood began to boil, and red lights danced before his eyes. He shook the bars of his cage, growling and barking like one of his wild ancestors. The demonicals looked over at the furious Wolperting, puzzled at first, then amused, then with gluttony written all over their hideous faces. Saliva oozed from the corners of their mouths, and their eyes shone with greed, but they dared not break the taboo and lay hands on their chieftain's property. They tossed the remains of the Haconian heedlessly aside, and stood there swaying, seemingly hypnotized by the sight of the frantic Wolperting. Rumo redoubled his efforts. He rampaged wildly back and forth, charged the door of the cage with his shoulder, rattled the bars until the hinges creaked. His behavior was infectious. The other imprisoned wild animals roared and snarled in imitation of Rumo's attempts to escape. All this din and commotion set the demonicals into a feeding frenzy. They lumbered over to Rumo's cage and kicked and shook the bars like maniacs. They had no key, but they were determined to break open his prison by main force. Using every ounce of their strength, they tried to wrench the door off its hinges. Rumo lay flat on the floor of the cage and gave a low growl. All he could see was iron bars and straining bodies. His view of the cave was blotted out by furry black bodies and faces contorted with greed. The cage was built entirely of iron, but it was only a matter of time before the hinges gave way under the combined onslaught of 3 mountains of muscle. There was a sudden thud, and one of the frenzied demonicals stopped short, staring at Rumo glass-eyed. Then he collapsed, restoring Rumo's view of the cave. 8 more demonicals were standing there, one of them with a lump of rock in his hand. It was the rulers of the island. There followed short, extremely one-sided fight in which the 2 surviving drunks came off worst. A flurry of punches on the jaw left them breathing their last on the ground. Rumo realized that this wasn't a normal tour of inspection. The moment of truth had come. He didn't make a sound and lay quite still when the giants opened the cage, seized him, and dragged him outside. He was behaving just as Smike had instructed. The chieftains were surprised and rather disappointed by his lack of resistance. They punched him in the ribs and tweaked his ears as they carried him along the torch-lit tunnels, but he moved as little as possible. Cold rain lashed his face when they manhandled him in the open air. The keen sea breeze was a relief after the fugue and stench of the cave, and he drew it deep into his lungs. The sky was obscured by inky blue clouds, flashes of lightning and flying spray. It was Rumo's first glimpse of the exterior of roaming rock. whose jagged peaks protruded from the sea like the towers of a city stinking beneath the waves, ablaze in the mouths of many caves were the fires beside which the demonicals warmed themselves and played their diabolical music.